Welcome. Welcome to this evening's Visiting Artist and Critics series talk from writer Kealey Boyd, who we're so delighted to have here with us. And Kealey will be sharing a little bit with us about how artists today are navigating creativity during this time of unprecedented uncertainty. This series is presented in collaboration with UCCS Visual and Performing Arts and sponsored by the Colorado Bank and Trust Company, Commander Patrick Sheehy, U.S. Navy, in memory of Janine K. Sheehy, the Alpamar Foundation, UCCS Student Government Association, and the UCCS Green Action Fund. On behalf of GOCA, I would like to thank the members of our Curators Circle, GOCA student staff members, some of whom are out there, our VAPA colleagues, thank you, and especially to my amazing colleague, Exhibitions and Events Manager, Lene Bowman-Cravens. And without further ado, I would like to invite to the podium Associate Professor and Co-Director of Visual Art, Ben Kinsley, to introduce our amazing speaker this evening.
Hey. Thanks for coming. Can you hear me okay in the small room? Do I need this? I probably need this for the cameras. Thanks for coming. This is great. I'm here to introduce Kealey. I just want to say, thank you for coming. This is great to have you give a talk today and then come back tomorrow to work with our students, our seniors, who are in the senior exhibition that opens on Friday, tomorrow at 5 o'clock at GOCA. So please, everybody, come to that. And it's really awesome, an awesome opportunity for our students to, especially after hearing this talk, I'm sure this will contextualize things, but the conversation tomorrow with Kealey is going to be really great for you guys. So this is a really exciting opportunity. So quickly, and I'll get off the stage here. Kealey Boyd is an art critic and regular contributor to the art newspaper and Hyperallergic. She has written for the Los Angeles Times, Frieze, Art Papers, College Art Association, and other publications. This year, she published an essay in the book Artists as Writers by Intellect Books as part of the Living and Sustaining a Creative Life series. Boyd is a member of the International Association of Art Critics. The real title's in French, but I got to see in French, so I made it in English for you guys. She also serves on the executive board of directors for Redline Contemporary Art Center and the board of directors for the Women's Studio Workshop. And it was just announced like this week that Kealey's a 2025 Clifford Still Institute Fellow in Art Criticism, so congratulations. She has a Master of Arts in Art History and a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from the University of Chicago. And I'm going to let Kealey tell you about the rest of it. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for everyone making time in the busy month of April. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Joy and Lene and Corey and Ben and Martha Russo, who connected all of us together. I really appreciate it. This is a great opportunity to share some of the things I've been working on for a couple of years and get some of your feedback. So I guess what I'll start with is that one of my favorite writers is Glenn Adamson. And in 2016, he wrote a book about called Art in the Making. And he starts the book by predicting that future art historians are going to look back at this moment that we're living in and be struck by the sheer proliferation of how much art is being made and its expansive reach without really any barriers to its production, and instead of talking about the content of the art of our time. And I don't disagree with that claim, but I just want to make an addition today in that historians, I think, will also find it remarkable the ways that art has been amended by the globalized supply chain structure and by trade policies. That artists have become so accustomed to material hopping out of necessity and adapting as a standardized practice and required skill that that whenever artists raise concerns about this trend, it is often downplayed or it's dismissed by your own peers. And I think material costs in the individualized labor structures of art, in the absence of guilds and unions in many decades, and funding scarcity in the United States for the arts, will become the barrier that Glenn Adamson says is absent. And I think that is what's shaping art today. So I'm going to start with this piece. Love this piece. It's a hand darkened with soot, struggling to grab a falling lead ingot in Richard Serra's 3-minute film, Catching Lead from 1969. Sometimes the hand is victorious in catching this commodity, but often the hand snaps shut, right? Only grasping air. And even when the hand does seize the desired good, it eventually has to release it to prompt it to drop again and to catch it again. Lots of writers and art historians suggest that this film is about the limits of an artist's intentions, but Serra describes his film as task-oriented. Serra made 4 of these hand films, which are all silent. They're all black and white, and they're all very brief. And in some of the other films, and one of them is called Hands Tied, we see his hands working to be freed from some twine that binds them. Hand scraping is, we see the hands of artist Philip Glass work to clear a pile of lead filings. And in hand lead fulcrum, Serra holds out a lump of lead in his arm until his arm becomes tired under the weight, and it slowly drops until it falls off the frame. And of course, there is no image if his hand is out of view. The films are subtle and they're repetitive, and I like to think of them as an excellent extension of minimalism or minimalist thought because the material is in the forefront. It is the focus. And convenient for me, I think, minimalists thought of themselves as laborers. Some even fashioned overalls or coveralls in their bio photos. So since 2020, I've noticed artists talking casually about what materials are scarce or how they are managing price volatility. And the challenges around materials sounded urgent to me. They sounded important. So I became interested in the types of choices artists have to make as independent contractual freelance workers. And if there are shared decision-making trends amongst creative laborers. But I just want to take a step back and maybe lay some groundwork for my inquiry. This is my grandfather on the far right. His name was Bruno, and he was a child of Polish immigrants. He was a tall barrel of a man with a bright face. He loved bowling and baseball, particularly the Milwaukee Brewers. And as it happens when people get older, Bruno had a really hard time remembering recent stories, but the ones from his youth were always crystal clear. He often recalled how he was angry at his father during the Depression, that he would butter his toast corner to corner when there was very little food in the house. On the flip side, Grandpa Bruno would enthusiastically share about the time he earned a paid apprenticeship during the Depression, where he would be trained as a draftsman, meaning that he learned how to draw up plans for machines and structures. When America entered World War II, Bruno and his wife Alice, my grandmother there, volunteered to move away from Milwaukee to go to Washington, D.C. to the Navy Yard. And he worked in the engineering department. He was a ship draftsman, and he was assigned to features like anti-aircraft guns. But the feature he really liked to talk about was their propellers that maneuver the boats. I've lost track. This isn't him, but this is an image from the Navy Yard, Washington, D.C. Navy Yard archive from World War II. He would talk about this first propeller that he ever executed. And he would talk about how everyone gathered around. He went by the nickname Barney before there was a purple dinosaur or a Simpsons character. And he would talk about how everyone said, oh, Barn, that's real nice. It's a real nice propeller. And how he was struck by everyone's admiration for how he took something from a humble sketch into reality, into this monumental scale. So after my grandfather passed away, I located, when I was trying to kind of refill stories and we were cleaning out his house, and we found all the remnants of every little project he started. He loved tinkering with lots of materials. There were no limits. And I came across this patent that he filed in July of 1940. It was, of course, it's expired now, but it was for a child's bowling game. And the patent outlines how the game works and the schematics of how to build it. A few years later, I was invited on a research trip with the Denver-based artist Sammy Seungmin Lee to Seoul, South Korea. She had earned a funding to make new work from the Art Council of Korea, and they provided her enough funding to bring her hanger-on like me to execute my own project. She didn't give me much heads up on the trip, so I did the thing they tell you never to do in school, in that I kind of hunted around for a research topic and evidence to fit evidence I hadn't yet uncovered to fit this topic. I didn't speak or read Korean, which they also tell you in school, and it's true, don't go someplace to research them when you don't know the language. And so I also had that limitation. So I only knew AI translator apps are much better now, but, and this was in 2019. And so I knew the one thing I had to do was stick relatively close to Sammy, who was going to set up shop at a studio in the Ujiro neighborhood of Seoul. Now, if you read about Ujiro today, it says it's a hip neighborhood, but in 2019, it didn't look like much. It was a labyrinth of alleyways crammed with iron castings and tool shops and bolts and wires sticking out into the alleys. It was a machinist domain. It was a manufacturing district with 50,000 tradesmen attached to it. Most of those shops operating since the 1950s after the Korean War. Ujiro operated very uniquely, though. No tradesman worked outside his or her capacity, meaning that no one hoarded projects. When a project came into the district, a project manager would be assigned, and all fabrications, big and small, would each component be assigned out to different shops. It was very common moving through the alleyways to see a runner with a large pulley cart taking projects from stop to stop. So I decided to run my grandfather's patent through the district to understand how it worked. And it took a couple days to find a willing project manager who worked with an American woman who didn't speak Korean. But once I did, I was pretty astonished by how quickly he was able to interpret the patent and its schematics and put it into production. So here you can see me documenting one of the metal workers soldering a component, specifically the lift that pulls the pins up on the bowling game. Prior to my arrival to Seoul, the Korean government had offered new facilities to a lot of the Ujiro workers to move to the edges of the city, to relocate, and gave them incentives to leave. The reason being is that the land Ujiro sits on is in central North Seoul, right off Namsan Park. It's very desirable land in the city, and the city wanted to develop it. Some Ujiro shops took the bait, they left, they went to this new fancy facility on the edge of town, but like an appendage, like a hand removed from the body, they soon failed and closed shop. The ones that remained continued forward. So now it's been 10 years since that whole relocation program, and many of the machinists that had initially opened their shops here are retiring. They had started during the Korean War, as I said, in the 50s, and there's no one to hand those keys to. And so the district is contracting. It is a fraction of the size that I saw it in 2019. But it still strikes me, show me an art district that's had its 75-year run, right? Point me to the collective or the commune with a lifespan of work. So what I learned at Ujiro from just an outsider's observance is that this place survived because artists understood that if anyone hoarded information, if anyone lowballed a project, it hurt the whole. That transparency was a strength. That material intelligence, this idea of understanding that pine is not like oak, that aluminum is not like steel, that you can see how those products move through the world and understand it, and that your public understands it, is something that is escaping our generation, but it was really valuable here. It was their lifeblood. And that despite all these strengths, it doesn't absolve all risks, right? Ujiro still is contracting. So I think there is something so interesting about Ujiro and how it operated in this coordinated fashion. Their risks were minimized by sharing them. Arguably, so was their upside, right? If their sustainability was their goal, they achieved it. But if stardom was it, then they didn't achieve that, right? But we're here and they are there, and our conditions are different, especially over the last 5 years. So how can an artist control outcomes when so many inputs are so outside of an individual artist's grasp? So a brief refresher on some of the volatility I'm going to talk about today. If you remember, maybe this graph in 2020, this is lumber. In 2020, if you remember, American sawmills closed due to the pandemic and shipping slowed. It caused lumber prices to increase by 288% by May of 2021. And the prices got so bad that people started, this is amazing, people started redesigning their projects with hollow steel because it was cheaper than lumber. Ongoing labor shortages, of course, continued to elevate lumber prices until almost a whole year later. Today, last I looked, lumber futures are around $600 for 100 feet of board. Which is right around where it was in 2023. The domino effect of lumber, of course, then caused steel prices to rise literally overnight. Quotes went from $2 a pound to $7 a pound, and suppliers were quoting prices that would normally be good for 30 days, and this is still a standard since COVID, now are only good till end of day. So the price movements meant fabricators or artists who were hired for a project months or years in advance of its display had to renegotiate those projects. And if they made a fixed bid, that meant they had to eat those costs. Lumber is mostly made here at home in North America and Canada and the United States. And although the US isn't the biggest producer of the steel, we're still in the top 5. So this is considered a domestic product, right? But aluminum is trickier. So China and Russia are 2 of the 3 largest producers of aluminum. In 2021, production wasn't the issue. It was how to get it out of either of those countries, especially after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So in 2022, air freight couldn't move through Asia, from Asia to Europe without going through Russian airspace. Rail freight couldn't go from China to Europe through Russia without uncertain passage or elevated insurance costs. So all that said, plus, in addition to these evolving global risks that we've seen, now today we're all tariff experts as well. I think I've listened to nothing short of a dozen tariff podcasts this week. So American imports 70% of aluminum, which is why it's a topic I've written about with artists. 60% of that comes in from Canada. So now when artists order metal, they don't know where it's coming from until it arrives. It says made in, stamped on it. But it typically says made in Canada when it comes. So there are very few American smelters in the United States, and sheltering them from domestic competition has had no impact. We've done these tariffs on aluminum in 2016, and there were no new smelters that were built. That's because it's really expensive and nobody wants one in their backyard. And so that's why aluminum production in the United States is at the lowest in 100 years. Now, since 2020, facing uncertainty with something as essential as material, I've interviewed over 50 artists to learn how they were adapting. The answers filtered down to really 4 strategies. 1, some artists amended their practice by scaling back, smaller work, working from scraps, stuff already on hand. The other strategy was harvesting from old work, destroying their archive, and salvaging. The third strategy was investing time and material costs to test a new material, to learn new material literacy. And the fourth is eating into their own margins or going into the red, specifically fabricators making fixed bids. So understanding art production today, as popular as it is to say, especially as it accelerates in pace, requires us to really get a handle on art as one of those commodities moving through the world amongst a complex market of commodities like steel, lumber, microchips, acrylics. But even more interestingly, for me, is how artists are making these decisions. So let's look at some examples. Local artist celebrity, Pard Morrison from Colorado Springs. He makes colorful aluminum sculptures, like a painting folding around a column. And because of the aluminum support, his work can live indoors or outdoors and not rust. He buys aluminum in sheets for his 150-pound columns. And typically the sheets are 60 by 121 inches in dimension of 1/16 inch thick. And in the supply chain disruptions of COVID, his cost tripled and the delivery time went from 3 days to 3 weeks. In 2022, PARD opted to raise his prices slightly on the work to absorb some of this cost, but not to fully absorb all the cost increases. So the recent tariff events, though, of 2025 on the material has been a game changer for him. It's unlike anything he saw in COVID. However, he is elected not to stockpile, not to transact ahead of the tariffs taking place, because as he said, that's a huge gamble, bringing raw material into the studio and sitting on it when there is no collector. And that's because he has watched since November his collectors, both public and private commissions, go on a wait and see strategy. Wayne Brugard is an incredible sculptor in Longmont who works with hardwood and bronze. And he agrees with Pard that substituting his material, Pard said, I was like, why don't you just go to steel? And he's like, that's my nightmare. And Wayne agrees. He thinks it would degrade his work to pivot away from bronze. In 2019, Brugard was paying $4 a pound for rolled bronze, but in 2022, it jumped to $7 a pound, and with a 3-month delay to deliver. If he wants to lock in the price when it's quoted and before delivery date, he has to put a 50% down deposit. Since his average sculpture weighs over 360 pounds, he has moved to working with scraps. Brugard assumed that the price jump was due to a large player in the market buying up all his bronze. Now, bronze can be delivered in lots of ways, lots of shapes. Ingots are like bricks, right? Or they can come in cylinders and rods and pipes, but rolled bronze requires a special machine to make it into sheets. He used Revere Copper, which is an American factory. He used them for 6 years. And Revere told him that how much the price was moving on him or was just strictly unavailable. And so he was like, it's Simone Lee. She's eating up all the bronze. And I was like, no, she has her own foundry. It's not her. So I called Revere Copper. Nobody there wanted to talk to me. So I just moved through all their LinkedIn profiles of all the employees, calling them one by one. I think I called about a dozen people, which you shouldn't do because then you don't know who's calling you back when somebody calls you back. But somebody did call me back and they said, it's really straightforward. The factory that made their metal products offshored to China. And the machine that rolls the bronze was elected not to be rebuilt at the new facility. It was just Keynesian economics. And so today, Brugard has started importing his rolled bronze from Germany, and it's at $12 a pound. But when I asked if he wants to pivot away from his hardwoods, which are not from Colorado, apparently you can't get hardwoods in Colorado. He has to get them from the East Coast. And his rolled bronze, he says, no, they're so beautiful. Why would I ever pivot away? But these are two examples now I've given you of artists that either absorbed costs or momentarily reduced their productivity. Roger Rudiman is a Boulder-based artist who is investing in new material literacy by pivoting away from the uncertainty of China and steel. So like many artists, he works with China for casting and stainless steel, particularly polished steel, which has that mirrored effect. Think like Jeff Koons' Balloon Dog. He notes that the polished steel pieces require about 200 to 300 hours of labor. If he were to conduct that here, with labor here in the United States or in Colorado, it would cost about $30,000. He can cast his sculpture, his huge outdoor monumental sculpture, ship it to China, have it polished, give that treatment, sent back, and the whole thing kit caboodle is $5,000. That's how much cheaper it is, which is why people rely on China. It's just like, it's so much cheaper. So in 2025, so in January, about a month before I called him, he started testing with resin, conducting deep pour applications, hundreds of pounds of the stuff. He says he thinks he's failing a lot, and so it's a lot of wasted resin, but he finds it to be a compelling alternative to metal casting. And resin is manufactured in the United States and has a very competitive international market. It's going to be very easy to access in the coming years. I would also like to just add that when I called Roger, he gave me the response of, I'm not your artist. I'm not going to help on this story. I'm doing fine. I'm unaffected. And then a day later, proceeded to email me 3 stories that all are about how he's pivoting. And so and how, and also the one story that when he last oversaw a project in China, he was really struck by the ethics of the labor and how poorly the labor conditions were in China, which also informed a decision for him to pivot away from steel. And that just reminds me that art making is so complex, because art is just as likely to be achieved by a fabricator, by a person, by a team, by a computer. And so often when we see writers talking about the role of these secondary hands in artwork, it's always from the position of authorship. But far from theory is this very simple engagement with raw materials and how they are sourced, the labor that makes them available to us, this very simple understanding of the ethics of making. And many artists don't see their choices as strategic, but they are. I interviewed, as one other side note, a New York City gallery about their Mongolian-based artist on their roster, and I was eager to talk about her materials. She was a painter, so it's very straightforward. We're talking about acrylic, we're talking about oil, and they were eager to talk to me. And then, as always is, right at the moment when I arrived, they're like, "We're not the right fit. We're not good for your story. This doesn't affect us." And so I just had to slow everything down. Tell me about where she gets her acrylic paint. Tell me about her canvas. Tell me about oil. And they said, well, we ship it to her because the locally available Chinese-made pigments are high in impurities, low in pigment quality. So we ship it to her. They did not see that as an intervention, but it is. It's a supply chain intervention that plucks her out of that locally sourced material and elevates her work and creates a better product. Artist Jennifer Ling Dachuk is from Phoenix, Arizona, and she's seen a myriad of disruptions on her material availability as early as January 2020 because she sources so much from China. She is a mixed media artist trained in ceramics. So kiln parts, wheels, all those things became real luxury items in 2020. Dachuk also used mirrored acrylic, which is typically really inexpensive and highly available material, but that just went away with sneeze guards, if you remember, in 2020, going into schools and businesses. And so she pivoted to using little tiny glass mirrors like the kind you find on disco balls. Dachuk also produces work with long curtains of hair, real hair. She has a relationship with the largest hair factory in Shenzhen. If you're looking at, no matter what the color or treatment is, if you are looking at real human hair, it probably came out of Shenzhen, China. And she has a nice relationship, but even getting products from them in COVID was very hard. So she ended up destroying 2 pieces from 2016 and 2019, including this large installation of red hair titled Thick, to make 2 new pieces that she was contracted for an exhibition. So Jennifer was really excited when things reopened, and in 2024, she traveled to China again to the porcelain city of Zhendejian, which is an old imperial kiln city. Everyone there is employed in clay in some way. And she sought to make plaster molds and procure ceramics, and plaster molds are really cheap. They're nearly free. They're worth nothing. And the ceramics she wanted were these large broken ones from the garbage of Zhendejian. And so, but when she arrived to ship her broken garbage, worthless, that she dug around in to find that had been cast off, US Customs told her that a value had to be assigned because a tariff had to be applied. And so ultimately, after much back and forth, art supply value was labeled upon them, which has previously never been tariffed. And a 7% tariff was applied in 2024. And her worthless creative goods cost her $2,500. So she confesses that every day she feels like it's a new thing. And she's really frustrated and told me that she has adapted so much in the last 5 years that she's not even sure how much more she can pivot. Now, historically, this is really interesting. We know materials swaps for artists communicate a lot to us about the current conditions. If you remember, like in the Dust Bowl, Clifford Still produced 19 paintings on window shades. And when raw canvas became unavailable in the World War, he painted on denim. So again, I would note that asking an artist to swap materials like oak to pine or an exotic alloy to aluminum is not a simple one-for-one transition. There is no bad material, but literacy in one medium does not necessarily migrate to another. I'll give you one last example. Sharon Loudon is a mixed media artist in New York City. And the pieces on the top are from 2023 Breckenridge, Colorado at Breck Create. And the bottom one is from University of Wyoming in Laramie from 2018. And she uses aluminum. Typically, aluminum is anodized, which means that it's made durable and it resists scratches and chips and peeling, all these things. But her supplier, Bob, at A Aluminum in Toronto, has offered her this raw aluminum that's highly reflective, mirror-like, 24 inches by 96, 20 millimeters thick, meaning 21/1000th of an inch, 21/1000th of an inch. And now she's hooked on this material. At that weight, the material can be torqued, it can be mounted, it can be bent in midair, like this image on the bottom, and that's what she wants. But it bothers her. She hasn't found another supplier besides Bob. And she has hunted everywhere, taking his samples all over the place, retracing the steps from places it was cut, and she's had no luck. In Breckenridge, the one image on the top there with all the color, those were adhesive vinyl. And she wanted that so she could slap it on the floors and the walls. And it's a really massive industry, right? It's regarding size and color and shapes. It seems pretty robust, pretty liquid. Sharon wanted yellow number 1286, but when she called the Texas supplier for vinyl, they said, honey, that color won't be available for months. It's race car season. And so she had to pick different colors. And I think that just shows how thin the supply market is and a vastly available product. If one client, the race car industry, are purchasing in that particular season, it shuts down availability. So I guess my point is that broken systems operate like this. And I know what you're thinking. All of this, it's, part of this is inflation, it's supply chain economics, it's tariffs, it's always something. Artists will adjust. It's such as capitalism. But we don't talk about artists like laborers. Guilds and unions in the arts haven't existed or organized in federal support of the arts haven't been witnessed since the 1930s. The decentralized approach to art policy is why the field is so market dominated. And so unlike European countries or even China, we have no pervasive culture of government funding in the arts. We rank last out of 138 countries when it comes to expenditure in arts and museums. And that figure is pre-Trump. So just as important to a discussion on legislative funding, which we should have in policies, is that about the arts, but we also should talk about that we don't show the public how any of this is made. We don't talk about it publicly. We don't name fabricators, of course, on museum walls. And maybe we're all getting ahead of ourselves because amongst us artists, we don't talk about it either. We don't share nothing with each other about how this is all working out. I had a studio visit around 2022, 2023 with Trey Duvall in Denver. He works in concepts of humor and futility, often with materials that are really familiar from domestic spaces like backyard trampoline, a broom, a lawnmower, or here ladders from the MCA Denver in 2023. It's called Intraction number 2. It's 12 8-foot aluminum ladders. They're attached to a high torque motor that runs at a low RPM at a randomized program over 81 days. So the idea is that these irregular cycles that the ladders will start to kind of walk, kind of skip, maybe jump at different times than the others, eventually tripping over each other, climbing, gouging the wall, trampling each other. And so anytime you went over the 81-day run, you would see a different assortment. And I went to a studio visit, and after looking at all the things he had put out to look at, I noticed a stack of oval stickers, manufacturing stickers or brand stickers stacked very neatly on a shelf. And I said, what's this? And he said, well, those are the stickers that go on the ladders. When I deinstall, I'm going to re-adhere them and take advantage of the very liberal return policy of Home Depot, because what he was paid did not cover the cost of the 12 ladders. And so, and around that same time, I went to another studio visit where artists disclosed distress around financials, but a fellowship had saved her year. And another artist who's a printmaker had expressed incredible guilt that she had bought a new car. And while a resident at Redline would park very far away because she would want to hide that from the other artists, that this is a constant theme here. And what I hear, I mean, my job is to listen to artists and then find the story and the common thread. And what I heard between the lines is maybe shame when it comes to money, or maybe it's a failure to reconcile the reality of creative life versus the life you imagined or aspired or expected. So with the help of poet Summer Browning and in her alternative art space, Georgia in Denver, aka her garage, I curated a show called Arm's Length. And arm's length is a financial term. It expresses the transacting parties that work independently from each other and totally in self-interest. And the idea for the DIY show is the image labels to each artwork would, of course, include the title and the artists and the materials and when it was made, but it would also include a pie chart of their financial income from the previous year. You can see the little painter's tape that we just use that to stick it on the wall. There were 2 sculptors, a painter, a mixed media artist, a textile artist, and a printmaker. So arguably different material constraints on these artists, right? Different education levels too. One artist had a fancy MFA from University of Houston, and one had no formal training, had gone to a couple night classes, and the whole range in between. Some had had lots of exhibition shows, lots of museum experience. I like to call them secretly the A-team, the artists that other artists talked aspirationally about. And yet, all these different things, the artists' pie charts looked remarkably the same. So, and this, by the way, this is Laura Schill on the left and Frankie Towen on the bottom. So yellow is jobs, second jobs. And if you had a fellowship, I included that. Orange is sales or exhibition fees. Gray is any one-time service, like a workshop or a talk, kind of like this. And anyone want to guess what blue is? It's their spouse. Because almost every artist sheepishly came to me in the process of us planning this and said, I don't make enough to live on myself. How do I account for that? It's definitely my spouse. And I said, okay, well, it's, this isn't an audit. This is just like a exercise. Why don't you think about what it costs you to live, and you know what you made last year. So if there's a gap, ask yourself if it's fair to say that your spouse made up the gap, and that's blue. And yes, it's not a statistically significant exercise. And yes, regionalism might matter here. 6 pie charts from LA or New York might look different. But what struck me was how similar the patterns were amongst very unique artists. And that tells me that the system we are operating in dictates more than your CV does in some way, or the pedigree when it comes to these income streams. Now, I was also, the bigger takeaway was I was struck by the reception. So it's an alternative art space, right? People who came through were other artists. And there were 2 reactions. Half reacted as total relief, like, oh, I'm not alone. Thank God. Like, thank you for showing me this. And the other half were angry. They were angry at me. They were disappointed in the concept. They were disappointed in me. They felt like this whole conversation was a diversion from the art, that this was bad. This was a bad approach. But even that reaction confirmed a suspicion I had, which was that no one was talking to each other and no one had any concept of how anyone else was making it. And it confronted a fear that even the most booked and busy of us were maybe still underwater. So artists are laborers that conduct project-based work, meaning it is typically contractual, allowing for many projects to develop at once. Because it is an alternative working structure, artists are usually not waged or salaried type of work. And so artists typically have difficulty accessing lots of social benefits like unemployment, insurance, parental leave, sick time, healthcare. 39 to 51% of artists pay for their health insurance versus the typical worker in the United States at 6% of the rest of the American workforce. Artists are 3.5 times more likely to be self-employed. There are 12% of artists state that they have a second job, 16% are unemployed, and 29% claim to the government that they are not in the labor force, which means that they tell the government that they're not looking for work, that they're not unemployed, but they wouldn't count making art as equivalent to 1 hour of paid work per week. Now, the US Bureau of Labor Statistics say that there are 2.5 million artists operating in our economy, and that the number is likely larger because of how they track artists and what they choose to disclose. But that range reflects that's a big range, 2.5 to 5 million. That reflects an employment structure for creatives being quite eroded, which led me to consider what labor studies and industry studies tell us about the dynamics of creative work. Is it just the nature of the work, or is it actually something else? So how many here are artists or students that plan to be professional artists or are teaching art or any who are artists? Okay, so like 90% of the room. Okay, so I'm gonna show you some traits, and I want you to ask yourself, does this apply to me? Consider if these traits sound familiar, because these are traits that sociological studies would call for anybody who's in individualized labor, somebody, meaning a worker who's operating in semi-isolation and definitely in an informational vacuum where they are unsure of what else is happening in the market around them. The traits of producers, according to the studies, and I would say artists, are you are intrinsically self-motivated, thus creating a surplus of work, hence lowering your pay based on the surplus of work you are making, especially if you are a newcomer to the field. Producers are close to their product from start to finish. That your number one employers are nonprofit or public sector. And because you were contractually, that you are always habitually, frantically networking. And in the rapidly changing economy of artists or producers, that it can have a short shelf life. And to explain that, go back and look at the list of artists in the 2000 Whitney Biennial and ask yourself if you recognize any of them. Traits of the industry, that creative industries tend towards informal, intimate, non-hierarchical, non-formal situations. Individualized labor means that there are an expansive number of decisions that fall on you that you have to make. And if you fail to make a decision, or you make a decision, either way, the consequences fall on you alone. And the decline of trade unions and guilds means any collective bargaining is less applicable for you. So you feel isolated. Finally, that the structure of productivity is part of the reason why I think artists are unlikely to pivot, because testing a new material, even when they know their current material is a situation that is very deleterious, the unknown results of testing feels daunting and feels like a costly unknown outcome. So there's that. So think about how many of those you're like, ugh, hit home. And then the final takeaway from my research on this topic of labor is that artists balance three things. They balance freedom of expression, financial security, and basically career aspirations or reputation, like the quality of the place you're showing your art. And you equally prioritize those three categories. And because you equally prioritize those three categories, you are willing to trade one for the other at any given time. Oh, I can get a show at the Whitney. I'm willing to get the $200 fee they pay. Or, oh, I can not be censored, but I have to take less pay. You know, these things, right? These scenarios of pivoting. And why I say this is because the work isn't inherently like this. It's not like this elsewhere in the world. The structure of artistic work conditions is just that. It's a structure, and which means that every contract or every commission is an opportunity for you to test that structure and test the assumptions around that structure. So I think applying this kind of primary research of talking with artists and hearing their stories, along with macroeconomic events and seeing how those stories shift under those events, along with all this sociological research on labor, is really fertile ground to understand our field of independent labor or creative labors and how we're each mitigating risk around this field. I think this topic has all these other capacities to discuss class and how class in the arts means that different artists of privilege navigate these problems differently, or how regionalism impacts material use or these are opportunities. And so my goal today with revealing some of these hidden structures from the public and even from other artists themselves, are kind of forcing you to look at them, is really my form of advocacy. So I'll end with this story. It's like an uplift. In 1929, things looked pretty dire in the United States too. The stock market had crashed, right? And at that time, artist Raymond Johnson had just relocated to Taos, New Mexico from Chicago and opened an art supply business in his garage in the hopes of supplementing his income after the crash. Artist Emil Bistrom had a commercial art business that was very successful in New York City, and that folded after the crash. Artist Ed Garman was just about to graduate high school from his Pennsylvania town and watched lawyers and doctors all getting laid off. And so the solution was this. Bistrom arrived in Taos in 1931, and he founded the Taos School of Art in his home. He wrote in his journals that he sold a watercolor for $57 that year, and it included the service of 7 critiques of the buyer's art. He lamented about how much he had lost and how bad the future looked. Garman figured out that if he left Pennsylvania and enrolled at the University of New Mexico, it would be cheaper than staying home in Pennsylvania. He could get 3 meals a day, a roof over his head, and a degree, and it would still cost less. So typically when we talk about artists that flock to this place of Taos or Santa Fe, we talk about it because it's romantic. It's such a beautiful place, and it is. It's incredibly beautiful. But the writing of the artists tell a totally different story from their own voice. There was no electricity in Taos. The roads were mud. There was only one phone in the center of town that was wired to the outside world. It was cheap. You could rent a house for $120 for a year with 50 acres. It was so cheap. They went there because it was cheap. Now, the Public Works of Art, that's not the whole story. The Public Works of Art project was born in 1933. It was when President Roosevelt created an executive order of the Civil Works Administration, and the aim was to put unemployed artists to work on public buildings and parks. And it had a skill-based pay grade from $26 to $42 a week. And in 1935, the Works Progress Administration established the Federal Art Project, which took over for the PWAP until 1943. Of the initial 2,500 artists in the first few years, 160 resided in New Mexico. Johnson, who I initially started the story with, he completed 6 WPA murals before he accepted a job at the University of New Mexico. Garman, who had come to be a student, he joined a WPA archaeological dig at ancient pueblos in the Rio Grande Valley, sorting pottery shards. Bistrom won several WPA commissions, including my favorite, the Taos County Courthouse, a project that he petitioned to add multiple other artists so they could all work as a group and all get fed. And in 1934, Bistrom received a letter from Ed Bruce, who was the Secretary of Treasury, thanking him for being in the WPA and writing, quote, "We should all recognize that art is an expression of national culture and that it takes artists of all schools and types to make this expression a well-rounded one. Artists of every country remain, in the last analysis, the true measure of civilization." Johnson, Bistrom, Garman, and 8 other artists all eventually went on in 1938 to establish the Transcendental Painting Group. They wrote about visions of another dimension and how color and light and art had the capacity to transcend you from the pain of today. So these members, which was wild talk at that time in 1938, to be saying that art could like take you to another dimension. They thought art could reach any viewer of any education, any background. And many members of the TPG were in the WPA. So I've argued that in the past that all those months of installing art and murals in public places like post offices and courthouses and schoolyards, that direct contact with the public allowed this kind of thinking about art, allowed them to see when they were no longer siloed in the galleries and no longer siloed in their studios, the public could really appreciate the skill of the artists in real time. The artists could see the public's opinion of art transforming. It was that back and forth that allowed for them to think about art in this way expansive way beyond just like abstraction. So through experimental government funding, because of the WPA and a culture-centered policy this whole new collective consciousness about art was one that was not just about personal pursuit, not just about materialist effort. Was possible. Art could resonate to universal experiences beyond the visible world. And I think that's still possible. And that's why I have presented you this research in the hopes that you can see that policy and funding can work together to create a better solution than the one we're working with, and that you should not feel like you're carrying these burdens alone. Thank you.